The first time I realized my life was tied to the most dangerous man I knew. I was standing alone under a flickering streetlight wondering why a black SUV had been following me for 3 blocks. In a city the size of Chicago, you learn to trust certain instincts, the quiet voice that tells you when something is slightly off, when the rhythm of the night doesn't match the usual pulse of traffic and distant sirens and late trains rolling across steel tracks. That voice was loud in my head that night. The sidewalk stretched ahead of me for another half-mile toward my apartment building, the yellow glow of streetlights reflecting off rain-soaked pavement while the SUV idled behind me like a patient shadow. I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe someone waiting for a ride. Maybe someone checking directions. But my hands were already reaching into my coat pocket for my phone before my mind finished arguing with itself. There was only one name I ever called when things felt wrong. Adrian Blackwood. Saying his name in my mind still felt strange sometimes, because Adrian wasn't just anyone. He was 20 years older than me. He had been my father's best friend since long before I was born. And in quiet conversations across the city, people spoke about him with the kind of careful respect usually reserved for men who controlled entire rooms without raising their voices. When I was a kid, he had been the tall man who appeared in our kitchen late at night drinking coffee with my dad, their voices low and serious while I pretended to be asleep on the stairs. As I grew older, I began to understand that Adrian moved through the world differently than other men. He didn't rush. He didn't explain himself. And wherever he went, people seemed to step aside without being asked. The SUV's engine hummed again behind me, pulling me out of my thoughts. I slowed my pace and glanced down at my phone screen glowing softly in my hand. My thumb hovered over his name for half a second before I pressed call. The line rang once, then twice. Adrian answered the way he always did, calm and direct, his voice deep and steady like nothing in the world could surprise him. Lily. It wasn't a question. He always said my name like he already knew why I was calling. I swallowed and glanced over my shoulder at the dark vehicle parked along the curb. I think someone is following me. There was a brief silence on the line, the kind of silence that felt like a door quietly closing somewhere far away. Where are you? He asked. I told him the street name and the corner I had just passed. Another short pause followed, but this one felt different. Calculated. Measured. Stay where you are, Adrian said. His voice hadn't changed, but something about the way he said it made the night feel less uncertain. I leaned against a lamppost and watched the quiet street stretch out before me. 3 minutes later, headlights turned the corner at the end of the block. A familiar black sedan rolled toward me and came to a smooth stop beside the curb. Adrian stepped out, tall and composed in a dark coat that moved with the wind. For a moment he simply looked at me, his eyes scanning the street, the parked cars, the silent SUV behind us. Then his attention returned to me. You shouldn't walk alone this late, Lily, he said quietly. I crossed my arms and met his gaze. You always say that. Adrian's expression didn't change, but there was something steady in the way he looked at me that made the cold air feel warmer somehow. That's because I'm usually right. Adrian did not rush toward the SUV behind us, and he did not raise his voice, yet the entire street seemed to shift the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk. He moved with the same quiet confidence I had watched my entire life, the kind of presence that made people pay attention even when he was standing perfectly still. The driver of the dark vehicle must have recognized him, because the engine hummed once, and then the car slowly pulled away from the curb, rolling down the street until its taillights disappeared around the corner. Adrian watched it leave without reacting. Only after the sound faded into the distance did he turn back toward me. Are you all right, Lily? He asked. I nodded, even though my heart was still beating faster than usual. I am fine. I just did not like the feeling that someone was watching me. Adrian studied my face for a moment, the way he always did when he was deciding whether I was telling the truth or simply trying to sound brave. The street light above us flickered again, casting a faint gold glow across the pavement. You should call me sooner next time, he said quietly. I crossed my arms and leaned against the lamppost. That is exactly what I did. Adrian almost smiled at that, although the expression was brief and easy to miss. The wind moved gently through the empty street while a distant train horn echoed somewhere near the river. Moments like this always reminded me how different Adrian was from everyone else I knew. Most men filled silence with explanations. Adrian simply existed inside it. He glanced once more in the direction where the SUV had disappeared and then opened the passenger door of his car. "I will drive you home." "You do not have to do that," I said immediately. "My apartment is only a few blocks away." Adrian raised one eyebrow slightly, a familiar gesture that had ended arguments between him and my father more times than I could count. "Lily," he said calmly, "it is almost 11:30 at night, and someone was clearly paying attention to where you were walking. You are not finishing that walk alone." There was no anger in his voice, no pressure either, just certainty. I sighed and slid into the passenger seat. The interior of Adrian's sedan smelled faintly like leather and coffee, exactly the way it had every time I had ridden in it over the years. As he started the engine, the dashboard lights illuminated his profile in soft blue reflections. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched the quiet street glide past the window while Adrian drove with steady hands that never seemed rushed. "You know, you still never told me how you always show up so quickly," I said finally. Adrian kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I pay attention," he answered. That was it. No explanation. No details. I turned slightly toward him in my seat. "You say that like it is normal." Adrian glanced at me briefly, then back to the road. "In my world, Lily, paying attention keeps people safe." Something about the way he said it made the words settle heavier than they should have. I studied the calm expression on his face, the same expression he had worn when I was 10 years old watching him talk with my father across our kitchen table. Back then I thought Adrian was simply one of my father's mysterious friends. Now, sitting in the passenger seat of his car while the city lights reflected across the windshield, I understood something I had been slowly realizing for years. Adrian Blackwood did not just pay attention to the world around him. He paid attention to me. The city outside Adrian's windshield moved in slow, quiet streaks of yellow light as we crossed another intersection, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke. Chicago after 11 at night always felt different than it did during the day, calmer in some ways. Almost like the city was taking a breath between the noise of daytime traffic and the rush of early morning commuters. Adrian drove the same way he did everything else, steady and deliberate. His hands relaxed on the steering wheel while the soft glow of streetlights slid across his face. Watching him like this always pulled me backward in time whether I wanted it to or not. When I was 8 years old, Adrian Blackwood was simply the tall man who showed up at our house after sunset wearing dark coats and quiet expressions. My father would open the door, clap him on the shoulder, and the two of them would disappear into the kitchen where the coffee maker would run long past midnight. Back then I would sit halfway down the staircase pretending to read a book while I listened to the low rhythm of their voices drifting through the house. I rarely understood the conversations, but I always noticed the way my father trusted Adrian. My father trusted very few people. One night, I remember walking into the kitchen because I could not sleep. I was probably 9 years old and still wearing socks with little stars on them. Adrian was leaning against the counter holding a mug of coffee while my father sat at the table with a stack of papers spread in front of him. They both stopped talking when I entered the room. "Lily should be asleep," my father said gently. I could not sleep, I told him. Adrian had looked down at me with the same calm expression he still wore now years later in the driver's seat beside me. He was younger then, maybe in his late 30s, but even back then there was something about him that felt solid and unshakable. He crouched down slightly so that we were almost eye level. "Did you try counting backwards from 100? He asked. I shook my head. "It helps sometimes," he said. "I tried it that night after he left, and it worked." After that I always associated Adrian with quiet solutions to problems. The car slowed as we approached my apartment building on the north side. Adrian pulled to the curb with the same smooth precision he always used and shifted the car into park. The engine idled softly while the streetlights reflected across the windshield. "You are thinking again," Adrian said after a moment. I blinked and looked at him. "How do you know that?" Adrian leaned back slightly in his seat. "Because you get quiet when you are remembering something." I smiled faintly at that. "You remember a lot about me for someone who says very little." Adrian turned his head and met my eyes directly for the first time since we started driving. "Lily," he said calmly, "I have known you since you were small enough to stand on the kitchen chair just to reach the cookie jar. That tends to leave an impression." I laughed softly under my breath and reached for the door handle, but before I opened it, Adrian spoke again. "Lily." His voice stopped me immediately. I turned back toward him. "If something like tonight happens again, you call me immediately. Do you understand?" There was no threat in his tone, no command either. Just a quiet certainty that reminded me of every late-night conversation he had shared with my father years ago in our kitchen. I nodded slowly. "Yes, Adrian." "Good," he said simply. Then he unlocked the doors and the soft click echoed through the quiet car, while the city lights continued glowing beyond the glass. The door unlocked with a soft mechanical click, and I stepped out of Adrian's car into the cool night air, but instead of walking straight toward the entrance of my apartment building, I hesitated beside the curb. The street was quiet again, the way it always became after midnight when most of the city had already gone inside. I turned back toward the car window where Adrian was still sitting behind the wheel, the engine humming quietly like it was waiting for instructions. He had not driven away yet. He never did. Adrian had always waited until I was safely inside before leaving, even when I was a teenager, and insisted that I could handle things on my own. I leaned slightly toward the open window and rested one hand on the edge of the door. "You do realize I am 25 years old, right?" I said. Adrian looked at me with that same calm expression that had followed him for as long as I could remember. "I am aware, Lily." "Then why do you still act like I am 12? Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because when you were 12 you tried to climb the backyard fence and fell into your father's rose bushes." I groaned quietly. "That was one time." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "It was 3 times, actually." I could not help laughing at that. Some memories apparently lived permanently in Adrian Blackwood's mind. The wind brushed through the empty street again, and the leaves along the sidewalk shifted gently in the glow of the streetlight. For a second, I studied him more closely than usual. Adrian had always carried a certain stillness around him, like someone who never wasted movement or words. Tonight was no different. His dark coat was still perfectly straight, his posture relaxed but alert, his attention fixed on everything happening around him even when he appeared completely calm. There was a reason people spoke his name carefully in certain parts of the city, even if no one ever explained exactly why. I hesitated before speaking again. "Adrian, can I ask you something?" "You already are." I rolled my eyes slightly. "How did you know that car was following me tonight?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once more down the street, as if confirming that the night had truly returned to normal. Then he looked back at me. "Because I noticed it earlier." "Earlier," I repeated. "Where?" Adrian's voice remained steady. 2 blocks before you called me." My eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Wait, you were already nearby." Adrian rested one hand on the steering wheel. "Yes." That single word carried far more meaning than he probably intended. I stared at him for a moment. "Adrian, were you already watching the street before I even called you?" Adrian did not look embarrassed or defensive the way most people. What if they had been caught doing something unusual? Instead, he simply met my eyes calmly. "I told you before, Lily. I pay attention." Something about the way he said it made a strange thought settle slowly in the back of my mind. Adrian had known where I was before I ever called him. He had arrived almost immediately after the phone rang. And now he was sitting here in his car waiting for me to walk safely inside like he had done countless times before. I studied his face carefully, searching for some sign that I was imagining things. "Adrian," I said quietly, "how long have you been paying attention to me like that?" Adrian did not look away. "A long time, Lily. Longer than you think." Adrian's words lingered in the cool night air long after he finished speaking, and for a moment neither of us moved. "A long time, Lily. Longer than you think." The way he said it was calm, almost casual, but something about it made my chest tighten slightly. I studied his face through the open window, searching for some hint that he was exaggerating or joking the way people sometimes did when they wanted to avoid explaining something complicated. But Adrian Blackwood had never been the kind of man who joked about things that mattered. The quiet hum of the car engine filled the space between us while the distant sound of traffic drifted through the city streets several blocks away. I crossed my arms lightly and leaned a little closer to the window. "Adrian," I said slowly, "that sounds a lot like you have been keeping track of where I go." Adrian did not immediately respond. Instead, he watched the entrance of my apartment building the same way he had watched the street earlier, calm and observant. Only after a few seconds passed did he answer. "Your father asked me to look after you." I blinked. My father asked a lot of people to look after me when I was younger. Adrian turned his head slightly toward me. "Your father did not ask them the way he asked me." There was a subtle difference in his tone now, something heavier beneath the calm surface. The kind of weight that came with promises made years ago. I rested my elbow against the car door and tried to make sense of what he was saying. My father had passed away 2 years earlier, and since then Adrian had appeared more often than he ever had before. Sometimes it was small things. A phone call to check if I got home safely after work. A quiet message asking if my car had been repaired after the engine light came on. At the time I had assumed it was simply his way of honoring an old friendship. But now the pattern seemed clearer. Adrian, I said quietly, what exactly did my father ask you to do? Adrian's eyes shifted back toward the street again before returning to me. He asked me to make sure nothing happened to you. I let out a small breath of disbelief. Adrian, I am not a child. I know that. Then why does it sound like you have been watching my life from a distance for years? Adrian did not seem offended by the question. If anything, he looked like he had expected it. Because sometimes paying attention from a distance is the safest way to keep someone protected. I frowned slightly. Protected from what? Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced at the door of my apartment building again and nodded toward it gently. You should go inside, Lily. It is getting colder. I did not move. Adrian. He met my eyes again, and for a brief moment the calm certainty in his expression softened just enough for me to notice something I had never seen there before. Concern. Real concern. Your father trusted me with something important, he said quietly. I intend to honor that trust. The simplicity of that statement somehow carried more meaning than any long explanation could have. I stood there for another second, studying the man who had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. Then I finally nodded and stepped back from the car. As I walked toward the apartment entrance, I could still feel Adrian's attention behind me, steady and patient the way it had apparently been for far longer than I had ever realized. The lobby of my apartment building was quiet when I stepped inside, the soft hum of fluorescent lights echoing gently against the polished tile floor. Mrs. Alvarez at the front desk glanced up from her magazine and gave me the same warm smile she had offered every tenant for the last 15 years. Good evening, Lily, she said kindly. Good evening, Mrs. Alvarez, I replied while brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. I walked toward the elevator, but before the doors closed, I could not stop myself from glancing back through the glass entrance. Adrian's sedan was still parked along the curb under the streetlight. Even from across the lobby, I could see the faint outline of him sitting behind the wheel, waiting exactly the way he always had. The elevator doors slid shut with a quiet mechanical sound and carried me up to the 4th floor. When the doors opened again, the hallway smelled faintly like laundry detergent and someone's late-night dinner. I unlocked my apartment and stepped inside, flipping on the light beside the door. My apartment was small but comfortable, a one-bedroom space with wide windows that looked down over the street. I set my keys on the kitchen counter and walked toward the window without even thinking about it. Part of me already knew what I would see. Adrian's car was still there. The streetlight cast a pale circle across the pavement, and his sedan sat perfectly still within it. For a moment, I simply stood there watching. He had said nothing about waiting. He never did. Adrian just stayed until he knew I was safe. The realization settled in my mind with a strange mixture of comfort and confusion. I pulled the curtain slightly aside and leaned my shoulder against the wall. The city beyond the glass looked peaceful tonight. A taxi rolled slowly down the block and disappeared at the corner. Somewhere far away, a train horn echoed again across the river. Adrian's car remained exactly where it was. My phone vibrated softly on the kitchen counter behind me. I turned and walked back to pick it up. The screen lit up with a single message. Adrian Blackwood. I opened it. Let me know when you are inside. I stared at the message for a moment before typing back. I am home. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Good. I walked back to the window just in time to see Adrian's car finally pull away from the curb. The sedan moved smoothly down the street and disappeared past the intersection until the red glow of the tail lights faded into the distance. I stood there for another moment longer than necessary, thinking about everything he had said earlier that night. Your father trusted me with something important. I intend to honor that trust. The words echoed quietly in my thoughts while I turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the couch. My father had always been careful about the promises he made to people, and he had always been careful about the promises he asked for in return, which meant whatever he had asked Adrian to do must have mattered more than I ever realized. I sank into the couch and stared at the ceiling for a while, replaying the night in my mind. The black SUV. Adrian arriving almost immediately after I called. The way he had admitted he noticed the car before I even dialed his number. A long time, Lily. Longer than you think. I exhaled slowly and closed my eyes for a moment. One thing had become clear tonight. Adrian had been watching over my life far more closely than I had ever noticed. And somehow I had the strange feeling that tonight was only the first time I had truly started to understand it. I woke up the next morning with sunlight spilling across the living room floor and the quiet hum of the city beginning to rise outside my window. Chicago mornings always arrived slowly, like the city needed time to gather itself before the rush of commuters and car horns and coffee shops opening their doors. For a few seconds I stayed on the couch where I had fallen asleep the night before, staring at the ceiling and remembering the strange feeling that had followed me to bed. Adrian's voice echoed faintly in my thoughts. A long time, Lily. Longer than you think. I sat up and stretched, rubbing my eyes while the smell of coffee from the apartment next door drifted through the hallway vent. The events of last night felt both distant and unusually clear at the same time. The black SUV, Adrian appearing almost immediately after I called him, the calm certainty in his voice when he told me my father had trusted him with something important. I stood and walked toward the kitchen, filling the coffee maker with water while the early morning sunlight reflected across the counter. As the machine started its slow brewing sound, I leaned against the sink and glanced out the window toward the street below. Everything looked ordinary again. A delivery truck rolled past the corner. A man walked his dog along the sidewalk while checking his phone. Nothing about the street suggested anything unusual had happened there just a few hours earlier. But something inside my mind had shifted. Adrian had always been part of my life in a quiet, almost distant way. He was the man who appeared on holidays sometimes, who shook hands with my father's old friends at gatherings, who asked if I was doing well in school, and then disappeared again into whatever world he belonged to. Yet recently he seemed closer to my life than ever before. My phone buzzed softly on the counter beside the coffee maker, pulling me from my thoughts. I picked it up and saw a message from an unfamiliar number. For a second I hesitated before opening it. The message was short. Unknown vehicles sometimes move through this neighborhood early in the morning. Let me know if you notice anything unusual. There was no name attached to the message, but I already knew who it was from. Adrian had never been the kind of person to fill his messages with greetings or signatures. I stared at the screen for a moment, half amused and half confused by the way he seemed to appear in my life at exactly the moments I was thinking about him. I typed a quick reply. Everything looks normal this morning. The three little dots appeared almost immediately as Adrian began typing. Good. The message arrived a second later. I shook my head slightly and poured coffee into a mug. Adrian's version of checking in always felt different from anyone else's. Most people asked how you were doing. Adrian observed your surroundings and quietly made sure they stayed safe. I carried the mug toward the window again and took a slow sip while watching the morning traffic begin to thicken along the street. For the first time I wondered how many other moments like last night had happened without me noticing. How many times Adrian had been somewhere nearby while I moved through my life completely unaware. The thought was strange, but it was not uncomfortable. If anything, it carried a quiet sense of reassurance. Adrian Blackwood had been watching over my life for years, and somehow I had only just begun to see it. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but the thought of Adrian's message stayed with me longer than I expected. After finishing my coffee, I got ready for work the same way I always did, moving through the small apartment while sunlight slowly brightened the street outside. By 8:30 the city had fully awakened. Cars moved steadily along the avenue below my building, and the sidewalks filled with people carrying travel mugs and briefcases. My office was only 15 minutes away, a small marketing firm near the river where the windows overlooked rows of older brick buildings and narrow streets, filled with coffee shops and lunch spots. Normally my walk to work felt routine and predictable, but today I found myself noticing everything more carefully than usual. I noticed the delivery van parked beside the bakery on the corner. I noticed a man tying his shoe near the bus stop. I even noticed the reflection of passing cars in the glass windows of nearby buildings. Adrian's words from earlier echoed in my mind without permission. I pay attention. For years I had assumed Adrian simply meant he was cautious by nature. But after last night it felt like something more deliberate. I reached the office building just before 9 and pushed through the glass door, greeting the receptionist on my way toward the elevator. The familiar sounds of keyboards and phones filled the hallway as the workday began. My desk sat near the far window, and after placing my bag down I turned on the computer while glancing outside at the river cutting through the center of the city. Chicago looked peaceful from up here. Boats moved slowly along the water and sunlight reflected off the tall glass towers surrounding the street below. I had just opened my email when my phone vibrated softly against the desk. Another message. Adrian again. Have you arrived at work? I stared at the screen for a moment before replying. Yes. Everything is normal here. The 3 dots appeared almost instantly as he typed back. Good. I smiled slightly and set the phone down. Adrian never asked unnecessary questions, but somehow he always knew exactly when to check in. The rest of the morning moved along with meetings and project updates, but every so often I found myself glancing toward the window without thinking about it. Not because anything unusual was happening, just because I had started to wonder how often Adrian might be somewhere nearby without me realizing it. Around lunchtime, I stepped outside with a sandwich from the cafe downstairs and walked toward the small riverside park across the street. Office workers filled the benches and walked along the paved path beside the water while the midday sun warmed the air. I sat down beneath a tree and watched the current move slowly along the riverbank. For the first time in a long while I felt strangely aware of the world around me. A black sedan drove past on the street beside the park and disappeared around the corner before I could see the driver. I shook my head at myself and laughed quietly under my breath. Adrian had managed to make me just as observant as he was, and he probably did not even realize it. Still, as I finished my lunch and stood to return to the office, I could not ignore the small realization forming in the back of my mind. The more I paid attention, the more I began to understand something important. Adrian had never just appeared in my life by coincidence. He had always been there quietly watching from somewhere nearby. The afternoon moved slowly after lunch, the way workdays often did when the sun hung high above the river and the city outside seemed calmer than usual. I returned to my desk and tried to focus on the campaign proposal sitting open on my computer screen, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the same quiet realization that had followed me all morning. Adrian had always been somewhere nearby, not in an obvious way, never standing directly beside me or announcing his presence, but close enough to notice when something felt out of place, close enough to appear the moment I needed help. Around 3 o'clock the office began to quiet down as people stepped out for coffee breaks or afternoon meetings. I leaned back slightly in my chair and glanced through the tall window beside my desk. The river reflected the sunlight in soft waves while boats drifted slowly beneath the bridges. For a moment, everything looked perfectly normal again. Then my phone vibrated gently against the desk. Another message from Adrian. The timing almost made me laugh. How is the afternoon? I picked up the phone and typed back. Quiet. Busy with work. Hey. Few seconds passed before the small typing indicator appeared again. Good. Stay aware of your surroundings when you leave the building later. I stared at the screen for a moment. Adrian rarely gave instructions unless he believed they mattered. That was something I had learned long ago. I typed a short reply. Did something happen? There was a slightly longer pause this time before his response arrived. Nothing serious. I simply prefer caution. The answer was typical Adrian. Calm, direct, and carefully incomplete. I set the phone down again and looked back toward the window. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many small details Adrian must have been noticing every day without telling me. The way unfamiliar cars moved through a neighborhood. The way certain streets felt quieter than usual. The way people behaved when they thought no one was paying attention. Adrian had built his entire life around observation, around patience, around knowing more about the world around him than anyone expected. A coworker passed my desk and waved as she headed toward the elevator. See you tomorrow, Lily. I waved back with a smile and glanced at the clock on my computer screen. 5 o'clock had arrived faster than I realized. I gathered my bag and shut down the computer before walking toward the elevator with the rest of the late afternoon crowd. The lobby of the building buzzed with the usual end-of-day energy as people stepped outside into the fading sunlight. I pushed open the glass door and paused for a second on the sidewalk. Traffic moved steadily along the street, and pedestrians crossed the intersection toward the river walk. Everything looked exactly the same as it always did at this hour. And yet I found myself scanning the street the same way Adrian probably would, paying attention to the details, noticing the rhythm of the cars passing by, the reflection of storefront windows, the distant sound of a horn echoing between the buildings. My phone vibrated again in my hand before I even started walking. One more message from Adrian appeared on the screen. Let me know when you are on your way home. I looked down at the words and shook my head with a quiet smile. Adrian never stopped paying attention, and somehow the more I noticed it, the more I began to realize something that had been true all along. The safest moments in my life had often happened when Adrian Blackwood was somewhere nearby, watching the world just a little more carefully than everyone else. I stepped away from the office building and joined the steady flow of people moving down the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the street as Chicago shifted into its evening rhythm. Cars rolled past in slow lines of traffic, and the air carried the distant sound of music from a restaurant patio somewhere down the block. I walked toward the train station the same way I always did after work, but today every step felt slightly more deliberate than usual. Adrian's message from earlier still lingered in my mind. Stay aware of your surroundings when you leave the building later. Normally I would have dismissed it as his usual cautious nature, but after everything I had noticed during the past 24 hours, his words carried more weight than they once did. I crossed the intersection and continued down the street beside the river where the sidewalks widened and the wind moved more freely between the tall glass buildings. The water reflected the orange glow of the lowering sun, while people gathered along the railing taking photos of the skyline. It was the kind of peaceful moment that made the city feel welcoming instead of overwhelming. Still, I caught myself doing exactly what Adrian would probably do in the same situation. I paid attention. I noticed the rhythm of footsteps around me and the reflections of passing cars in the windows of nearby buildings. I noticed the sound of a bicycle rolling behind me before it passed on the bike lane beside the curb. Most of all, I noticed the familiar vibration of my phone in my hand just as I reached the entrance of the train station. Adrian again. Are you leaving the office now? I smiled faintly and typed back while stepping onto the escalator. Yes, on my way to the train. The reply arrived almost instantly. Good. Text me when you reach your stop. I slid the phone into my coat pocket and stepped onto the train platform where commuters waited in quiet lines. The train arrived a minute later with a rush of wind and a soft metallic sound as the doors opened. I found a seat near the window and watched the city begin sliding past as the train pulled away from the station. Chicago looked different from the tracks. Neighborhoods shifted from glass towers to brick buildings and quiet streets lined with trees. As the train moved north, I rested my head lightly against the window and thought about the strange pattern that had been revealing itself piece by piece. Adrian had been part of my life for years, yet I had only recently begun to understand how closely our paths had actually crossed. The train slowed as it approached my stop, and I stood up with the rest of the passengers. When the doors opened, I stepped onto the platform and pulled out my phone again. Reach my stop. I typed the message while walking toward the station exit. The reply came seconds later. Good. Walk home and message me when you are inside. I laughed softly under my breath while pushing open the station door and stepping onto the sidewalk outside. Adrian never stopped paying attention. The evening air felt cooler now as the sun disappeared behind the buildings and the streetlights flickered on one by one along the road. I began the short walk toward my apartment building, passing the same coffee shop and bookstore that I passed every evening. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did. Calm, familiar, safe. But as I approached the corner near my building, I noticed something that made me pause for half a second. Parked beneath the streetlight across the street was a black sedan I recognized immediately. Adrian had not just been paying attention from somewhere far away. Tonight he had come to the neighborhood himself. The moment I recognized the black sedan beneath the streetlight, I slowed my steps without even realizing it. The car was parked along the same curb where Adrian had stopped the night before, its dark surface reflecting the soft glow of the evening lights. For a second, I simply stood there on the sidewalk watching it, the quiet neighborhood around me settling into its usual nighttime calm. A couple walked past with a small dog, laughing softly as they continued down the street, completely unaware of the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. Adrian had already known I was on my way home, and now he was here again. The driver's side door opened before I even reached the curb. Adrian stepped out with the same steady composure he carried everywhere, his tall frame outlined by the pale circle of light above the street. He closed the door gently, and turned toward me as if this meeting had been perfectly ordinary. "Good evening, Lily," he said calmly. I stopped a few feet away and crossed my arms with a small smile that carried more curiosity than annoyance. "Adrian," I said, "you told me to message you when I reached home. You did not say you were already waiting here." Adrian glanced briefly down the quiet street before returning his attention to me. "I prefer to be certain." I shook my head slightly, though I could not help smiling. "You really do take paying attention seriously." Adrian's expression softened just enough to show a hint of amusement. "It has served me well." The wind moved lightly through the trees beside the sidewalk, while the last traces of daylight faded from the sky. I stepped closer to the curb and leaned against the streetlight pole, studying him the same way he often studied the world around him. Adrian looked exactly the same as he had the night before, calm and composed, his dark coat moving slightly in the breeze while his attention remained completely focused on me. "You know," I said slowly, "most people would call this behavior a little unusual." Adrian tilted his head slightly. "Watching out for someone you care about is unusual. When you put it that way, maybe not." Adrian rested one hand lightly on the roof of the car and glanced toward the entrance of my apartment building. "You should go inside. It is getting late." I followed his gaze toward the door, but did not move yet. "Adrian," I said quietly, "how often have you done this?" "Done what?" "Waited nearby like this without telling me." Adrian looked back at me again, his expression thoughtful for a brief moment before he answered. "More times than you would probably believe." I let out a slow breath and laughed softly under my breath. Somehow that answer did not surprise me at all. The more I paid attention, the more the pattern revealed itself. Adrian had been present in the background of my life far longer than I had ever realized. I pushed myself away from the pole and stepped toward the apartment entrance. "Thank you for the ride last night," I said as I reached the door. Adrian gave a small nod. "Good night, Lily." I paused just before going inside and looked back at him once more. Adrian Blackwood was still standing beside his car beneath the quiet glow of the streetlight, watching the neighborhood with the same patient awareness he always carried. And for the first time in my life, I fully understood what it meant that my father had trusted him with something important. I stepped inside the apartment building, and the glass door closed softly behind me, sealing the quiet street outside from the warm light of the lobby. For a moment, I stood there without moving, watching Adrian's reflection fade from the glass as he returned to his car outside. Mrs. Alvarez looked up from the front desk again and smiled kindly. "Good evening again, Lily." "Good evening," I replied while walking toward the elevator. My mind was still replaying the conversation from outside. More times than you would probably believe. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime and carried me slowly up to the 4th floor. When the hallway came into view, I stepped out and walked toward my apartment, the familiar carpeted corridor quiet except for the distant sound of a television playing behind someone's door. I unlocked my apartment and stepped inside, turning on the lamp beside the couch while the room filled with soft yellow light. The first thing I did was walk toward the window. I did not even need to think about it anymore. The streetlight outside illuminated the same patch of pavement where Adrian's car had been parked earlier. Now the space was empty. He had already left. Adrian never stayed longer than necessary. Once he knew I was inside safely, he disappeared back into the city the same way he always did. I leaned lightly against the window frame and looked down at the quiet street below. A single car passed slowly through the intersection before continuing down the block. Everything looked peaceful again, but the realization from earlier that evening had not left my thoughts. Adrian had been watching over my life for years without ever announcing it. The pattern was too clear to ignore now. I walked back toward the couch and sat down, letting the quiet of the apartment settle around me. My father's voice drifted faintly through my memory, the way it sometimes did when I thought about the past. I remembered one particular night years ago when I had been standing in the kitchen while my father and Adrian spoke quietly near the back door. I had been 17 at the time, impatient and curious about everything. I remember my father looking at Adrian with the same serious expression he used whenever he was making an important decision. "If anything ever happens to me," he had said calmly, "I want you to keep an eye on Lily." Adrian had not hesitated. Of course. At the time, I had not understood the weight behind that simple promise. I had assumed it was just something adults said to reassure each other. But now, sitting alone in my apartment years later, I realized that Adrian had treated those words as something far more serious than a casual request. He had treated them like a responsibility. My phone vibrated softly on the coffee table beside me, pulling me back into the present. I reached over and picked it up. Adrian Blackwood. One new message. Inside safely. I smiled faintly and typed a quick reply. Yes. Thank you. The response came only seconds later. Good. Rest well tonight. I set the phone down and leaned back against the couch, staring up at the ceiling for a moment while the quiet of the apartment wrapped around me. For most of my life, Adrian had simply been part of the background of my world, a calm and distant presence connected to my father's past. But now I understood something that had been true all along. Adrian had never just been watching the world around him. He had been watching over me. That night, the apartment was quiet in the gentle way only late evenings could be, when the sounds of the city softened into distant traffic and occasional footsteps along the sidewalk below. I sat on the couch for a long time after Adrian's last message, letting the calm settle around me while the soft glow of the lamp filled the living room. For years I had thought of Adrian Blackwood as a man who belonged mostly to my father's world, someone who appeared occasionally in the background of family gatherings and serious conversations I was never meant to hear. But the truth was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. Adrian had never truly been part of the background. At all. He had simply chosen to stand far enough away that I would not notice him. I stood and walked back toward the window once more, pulling the curtains slightly aside as I looked down at the street. The same streetlight cast its quiet circle of light across the pavement where Adrian's car had been parked earlier that evening. Now the road was empty again, calm and ordinary, but the memory of him standing there beneath the glow remained clear in my mind. The city moved around me the way it always did, unaware of the quiet promise that had shaped so much of my life. Somewhere out there, Adrian was still moving through the night with the same careful awareness he carried everywhere, paying attention to details most people never noticed. And somehow, without ever announcing it, he had made sure that my world stayed steady and safe. I stepped away from the window and turned off the lamp beside the couch before walking toward the bedroom. As I lay down and closed my eyes, my thoughts drifted back to my father one last time. He had known Adrian better than anyone. If he trusted Adrian with something as important as my safety, then he must have known exactly the kind of man Adrian truly was beneath the calm exterior. The realization felt strangely comforting. Adrian had never asked for recognition or gratitude. He had simply kept his word. Somewhere deep in the quiet of the night, my phone vibrated once more on the nightstand beside the bed. I reached for it and saw another short message from Adrian. Everything quiet tonight. Rest well. I looked at the words for a moment before setting the phone back down and turning off the light. The apartment fell into darkness except for the faint glow of the city beyond the window. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to relax completely, because now I understood something that had taken years to see clearly. The most dangerous man I had ever known had never been the threat people whispered about in quiet conversations across the city. He had been something very different. He had been the man my father trusted to watch over me, and the one person who had quietly kept that promise every single day since.